Actually, it's always interesting to see that I work so close to Tony that every time I listen to him, I learn a new thing. So that's always good. And this is also why I enjoy this meeting very much, although I was only able to join you for today, because I'm a strong believer in dialogue between regulators and industry and academics and clinicians, because at the end of the day, we all are in the same ball game, of course, with different responsibilities, etc. But I think TOPRA and this whole platform, I think it's important. I was asked to talk about risk benefit and reality, but I changed the title because I have a problem with risk benefit. I'm a quantitative scientist, and a risk benefit, I'm talking about a positive risk benefit from a quantitative point of view. A mathematical point of view doesn't make sense to me. There's another issue, I think, that I'm not interested in drugs that are safe that don't work. So when I became the chairman of the MIB about 4 years ago, I changed policy. I say, although I know it's in the legislation, everything we communicate internally and externally should talk about benefit risk. So apologize to the organizers, but that's the reason I changed the title. Before I start with some real work, I think I want to share with you my background. My background is pharmacoepidemiology and drug safety, and I'm still holding that academic position. And I try to combine that with a regulatory job. For a couple of years, I was a member of the Pharmacovigilance Working Party, and since 2009, I'm a co-opted member for pharmacoepidemiology of the CHMP. And I have a number of other roles, but I would like to emphasize this because in those different roles, I was either as a rapporteur or co-rapporteur, but also being the chair of the MRB, I'm the leader of the teams that bring these referrals or bring the assessment reports to the CHMP or to other committees. Well, let's start with a number of comments of the spirit I would like to use in this talk, and that's this little slide. This is, at least from my perspective, the oldest slide I know from drug regulators, the FDA, and you look at these curves, and then the question is, of course, what is the public purpose of these people? Is that, being the policeman of the sector or trying to serve the public health? And again, I would like to emphasize, I feel much more with service of public health, although we have to be sometimes very tough to you, and I realize that industry is not always like us, but on the other hand, I think there is only one goal, and that's we have to serve public health and individual patients. And from that perspective, I will not focus on bringing a drug to the market. All the examples I would like to discuss with you is referrals or other procedures when a drug is already on the market. And then the question is, well, should we police that? And from that perspective, it could be very easy, right? Get the drug from the market. But I think also a major role for regulators is to keep good drugs on the market. And from that perspective, I would like also to share with you some experiences. Okay, importantly, I think it's important that what's the basic role? When my children ask me, what are you doing? So then I say, well, I'm in this little circle, trying to find out whether the effects of drugs, whether the benefits outweigh the risk. And that's always a very delicate question. Also, coming back to the discussions we had this morning, is of course data and evidence. There is some logic, statistical rules, guidelines, all kinds of policies to maintain and also to achieve consistency. But at the end of the day, that circle is what we do. And there is another reason to put it in a cyclic way, is because it never stops. Yeah? Already Tony, but also Tony already referred to that. When I take 5 decisions I make on a daily basis, it's only one is related to a new drug. 4 out of 5 is, about variations, about new indications, about better use, etc. There is another reason I would like to share you this slide, because I think in terms of transparency, I think it's important that we also acknowledge that regulators, as industry people, have their personal bias. There is always a judgment. There is always group dynamics. But I think, and I would would also to highlight that there are quite a number of EMA CHMP projects directed to minimize these, so that at the end of the day, we can show to you, to industry, we can show to the public, we can show to the other stakeholders that the decision is made on the best data available. And the problem here, of course, it's never a black or white picture. It's always gray. It's very often gray. And I think it's our role together in collaboration also with academics and in dialogue with the industry also to find out where is some light so that we can make an appropriate decision in the benefit of patients and public health. And of course, there is some governance there, and I would like also to emphasize at the end of my talk so the need for more regulatory science to also to make better decision making possible using better methods, but also having an other approach of the regulatory system apart from the procedures and the legislative system we are working in. Importantly is also that the current landscape, and Tony already mentioned also a number of examples, it's changing. And the examples on this slide are, for most of you, not new, but there is one overarching issue. And when I go over these, we have, for instance, the ongoing discussions about immune effect, very specific on some of the monoclonal antibodies. Very efficacious drug, very often, very powerful drugs. I think it's real innovation. But at the end of the day, there is also concern about, and that was, of course, highlighted in the past, the TNF-alpha blockers and infections. But now we have the PML discussion ongoing as we speak in this conference. And, of course, also the vaccines and narcolepsy ongoing. In particular, the vaccine and narcolepsy is a very interesting one because most of the problems we see in Sweden and in Finland, a little bit in some other countries, but overall, we don't see any strong signal. I strongly believe that the Swedes and the Finns have a problem. The question is, of course, what does that mean from a European perspective? Because the legislation said that we have to take a European standpoint, a European license. And more, I think we have examples that we see some issues there. And we never had an SPC so far saying, well, this drug is not good for Swedes or Finns. Well, maybe we have some. Then, of course, we have the cancer risk and diabetes, as we have mentioned also by Tony, where I think this is a very important issue. And with the growing epidemic of diabetes, with the growing epidemic also of severe diabetes, where patients are not treated well with only one compound, where we need real new data and new compounds also in combinations with insulins, with metformins, the new agents, but where there is an ongoing discussions about the pancreas cancer, the pancreatitis, the bladder cancer, the thyroid cancer, and so on. And this is, of course, also an issue, what are the best methods to focus here? And I will come back to that later because more and more we have to realize that the cured methods, whether they are trials, observational methods, are not always suitable to get the best answer. And when that is not possible, when the methods are not giving the right data, well, then value judgment is at the table. Then we have, of course, an ongoing story about long-term effects. And that is, of course, a new phenomenon because in the past we had much more on short-term use, but taking the biphosphonate, but also taking the monoclonal antibodies, for instance, for multiple sclerosis or other. Very important drugs in my view. And where recommendations say, well, chronic use is the standard. That is recommended. So we see now patients with 3 or 4 years, 5 years, even longer years of exposure we never saw before. We see safety issues now we never saw before, and we have to deal with these issues in an appropriate way. Well, the variability of the safety issues already I mentioned. That is not only there with the vaccines and the narcolepsy, we see it also with some of the non-steroids and the liver disease. And then finally, we see an ongoing discussion, can we minimize these risks by biomarkers? Well, topical examples, of course, HLA and the discussions about liver disease, the GCV and the PML, is not ready yet, but I think it's very important to look at it. But when I would like to summarize this whole slide, it comes back to this graph. When we go back to history, 20, 30 years ago, the big picture of safety was the rare, unexpected, type B, we never saw before in clinical trials, etc. That is in this picture, the black pattern. A whole low baseline risk, you give a drug and you see, boom, a huge effect. And that is, of course, easy going for the pharmacovigilance people because there is a strong signal and very often we know what to do. All the examples I just showed you, but I can go on with a longer list, are the red pattern, where patients have already a high baseline risk, take diabetes patients, take patients with arthritis, and then you give a drug, and then you see an increased risk with a relative risk of 1.5, 1.2, sometimes even less. And what does that mean? Is there indeed an increased risk, or is it all confounding, or is it bias? What is it? You know? And examples here, of course, the diabetes and cardiovascular risk. If you go into that, you give these drugs to prevent cardiovascular events. So if you then see an increase of myocardial function in a cohort of diabetes patients treated by these drugs, well, the question is, is it the drug or is it the patients that are using these drugs? The same is there with obesity drugs and psychiatric disease. You give, these drugs also to prevent, certain psychiatric events, at least to help that patients feel better, etc., and doesn't happen. And all these examples show that we deal with the red pattern more and more. And if I go back to the list of Tony, of all the referrals, etc., and I would like to summarize it, there is always a discussion, what do the data really say? And I think that the PRAC will be marinated with cases of the red pattern, with a lot of discussions about what do the data really say. And every Friday, because Friday is the biggest day of pharmacovigilance, because every Friday afternoon, you're sitting on your couch, there's always somebody who calls you. You say, well, have you seen the Lancet? Because there is a guy that calls that says that your drug is poison. And when your boss calls you, and you're sitting with your partner on the couch, there's a nice glass of wine, you say, well, weekend, and he calls you, he say, I want to have a plan in 2 hours, call me back, then we have this red pattern. Yeah? So future is there, and I hope you be prepared to that. And it is also seen with these 4 recent market withdrawals. And I think you know all the examples, the Acomplia, the Raptiva, the Ridictil, and the Avandia. 3 out of these were at Article 20 referrals, and 1 was an 107 referral. And all the 320 were led by the Dutch MIB. You could say, well, these are very nasty people because they keep all these drugs, from the market. But I think we had good reason to bring these to the table, and we had good discussions. And I think it's always a sad moment to come to a negative opinion. But to go into these, very important, again, all the 4 cases were not, unknown from the beginning. If you go to the pharmacology, if you go to the mechanism, all 3 could be expected from the beginning. But at the moment of a positive opinion, or the moment of a positive approval, there was, the opinion, if appropriately used according to the label, the benefits of this drug outweighs the risk. But at the end of the day, it didn't work out. Because, coming back to the Riemer-de-Band case, well, a basic part of the discussion was also patients were using the drug too short to get the benefit. But you saw already the increased risk of adverse effects right from the beginning. Well, then the balance is difficult to make positive. In the Raptiva case, we have to say also the uncertainty at that time, we're talking about 2009, about how to deal with PML was a factor. But also another factor that played a role was, of course, alternative options. And there, at the end of the day, CGP said, weighing everything together, it's important. Because also the company, but also the regulators together were not able to come with an appropriate risk minimization program that really helped us to come to a positive benefit risk. In sibutramine, that's another, because it was an MRP product, I understood, and the use of high-risk patients was also concerned from the beginning. And the SCOUT trial, commissioned also by the regulators, was very important to come to a negative decision. But it's interesting, if you look at the result of the SCOUT trial, was a relative risk of 1.2. I always teach my students 1.2, you have to go to the bias and confounding toolbox and try to understand what you really see. Although the SCOUT trial was a randomized clinical trial, so we said, is confounding or is there a bias? Of course, we think that it's very little, but at the end of the day, it came to a negative decision. And very recently, it was also one of the slides of Tony, rosiglitazone and the cardiovascular risk, a negative benefit risk because on the on-label population. And this is also a clear example where from our perspective, the risks were acceptable if they would be outweighed by good beneficial data. That was not the case. So again, here, safety discussions and discussions about efficacy are very close to each other, not separated. And I think this is also one of the reasons, the Prague discussions and also the collaboration, in my view, between the Prague and the CHMP are very important. But overall, and I would like to summarize this little analysis on these 4 slides, is we see that at the end of the day, risk minimization was not important. I think it's a failure of the whole system. I think it's a failure also that at the end of the day, because all 4 drugs, in my view, could be handled when they were used and taken into practice in an appropriate way. But we were not able to achieve that. And I think there's a strong message from that as well. The case I would like to discuss with you in more detail is drawn around the Multaq. And I think most of you know that drug is for atrial fibrillation. The initial application was in 2005. It was withdrawn by the company in 2006. And then there was a reapplication in 2008. And there was the Athena trial, a good trial, 5,000 patients. And there was a relative risk of 0.6. And then the discussion in the CHMP, and everything I say here is in the public domain, so you can look at that in more detail at the EPAR or other sources, was also a discussion about, okay, we have amiodarone, another standard treatment in this case. What does this drug show in terms of benefit risk compared to the new one? And then the CHMPs also said, well, we need comparative data. And then the comparative was made, and the diagnosis trial was part of the dossier. It was designed as a superiority trial, but the result was that amiodarone was less efficacious, that diadarone was less efficacious than amiodarone, but had a better safety profile. Tolerability was better. And that was important also to come to a positive benefit risk. And there were all kinds of discussions in terms of clinical endpoints and the indications, but CHMP came to a positive benefit risk, and the drug was licensed in 2009. Well, what happened since then? Of course, here was the diagnosis trial, and coming back to the discussion we had this morning on the reimbursement and HDE people, this trial convinced the CHMP to come to a positive benefit risk. Less efficacy, but a better safety profile. But the same trial has been used by the reimbursement and the HDE people all over Europe, and that led that some countries don't reimburse the drug. And that comes to the comment I made this morning, that if you want to go to the post-approval commitments, doing post-approval safety studies, well, you see that this in the countries where the drug is not reimbursed, these studies are not possible anymore. But this is it where, in my view, and I'm very positive about the alignment between the reimbursement and the HDE people and the regulators, but here, an requirement by CHMP worked against a positive HTA decision. And we should be aware about that. Yeah? And also, for that reason, dialogue is very important. But just recently, we had an ongoing Article 20 procedure, also led by the Dutch group, the MIB, because we are the rapporteur of Multaq, where there was a lot of concern. Initially, it started with liver concerns, then lung toxicity came on top of that. But while this procedure was ongoing, we were informed about the results of the PALACE trial. And the PALACE trial just was published in New England Journal of Medicine just recently. And you see here the data that essentially dronedarone is not better than placebo in terms of certain unwanted outcomes, stroke, myocardial infarction, and so on. And then the question is, what does it say? Well, the most important part, of course, was that the PALACE study was done in an off-label population, in a more severe population. But the end of the day, and that is one of the last slides I would like to show, is that a couple of months ago, the CHMP decided that the benefit risk of Multaq is still positive, although with a very strict restriction of the indication, and I think for good reasons. But I should show you, the committee considered that the availability of a range of treatments for a difficult condition, such as atrial fibrillation, was important, and that for some patients with non-permanent atrial fibrillation multi remains a useful treatment option. The reason I'm showing you this is that coming to a positive or negative benefit risk is very often a very delicate weighing. And here, also the SAC, and also, input of other aspects say, well, we have concerns. These concerns also are driven by all the data. But at the end of the day, the CCP believes that there is still, for a narrow indication, a position and a role for this drug. To come to my conclusion, I think all these referrals and variations show, and well, David, you're on the picture here. I didn't realize that you were here today, but it's important that we think that it's important to always do our work, whether you work in industry or regulators, but also have an open mind to, are we really benefiting innovation, really benefiting public health, really benefiting also the individual patients. And I'm close involved in a project called the Asher Project, published by sponsored by the Dutch IMI and the TR Pharma. And there we have all kinds of discussions of biomarkers and access and risk-benefit roles, etc. And I think it's very important also that discussions as we have today, that we not only address on, okay, what is the take-home message in terms of the procedure for next Monday or what to do on Tuesday, but also think about how can we put regulatory systems in the sake of patient safety, in the sake of public health, and the sake also of innovation. And this is a letter our group had in Science a few months ago, where we reacted on a pack hamburger of the FDA, where we said, well, at the end of the day, it's not only important to look at where regulators put up hurdles, but also where regulators can really force, the direction of drug development in the right direction so that we have drugs with a sustained benefit risk on the market. In conclusion, I strongly believe that the benefit risk of a licensed medicinal product is, of course, based on data, logic, and judgment. And I showed you a number of examples where we say, well, the thin line between a positive and a negative benefit risk is, is not always very strong to identify. Dealing with uncertainties, of course, require good data, but also an open mind. Because in the aftermath of the mediator case, already referred also by other speakers, is not very helpful in staying away from the precautionary model. Because the easy way now at the moment for regulators to say no to everything. And I think that's not the way we want to go. The benefit risk of a medicine is often a function of the way it's used in clinical practice. However, we regulate products and not what doctors or patients do. Yeah? And a new EU pharmacovigilance legislation will shape a new environment for benefit risk assessment of medicinal products before, pre, but also after marketing. But I think also, coming back to the interaction also with the regulatory science people, we need more regulatory science to screen off the bad use that is possible. And having said that, Chair, I would like to close. Thank you.